Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our Sunday service for May 21st of 2023. Last week, we had Mother's Day, and today I would like to share a little bit with you about Myrtle Fillmore, who's considered the Mother of Unity. And during my talk today, I will be sharing with you some slides of different aspects of places Myrtle lived and different things that people she met, things like that. So to start with, Myrtle was born Mary Catherine Page in Pagetown, Ohio, on August 6th of 1845. And her father called her my little Myrtle. Later on in life, she just took on the name of Myrtle because of that. As a small child, in the afternoons after her chores were done, she recalled that her favorite thing would be to go down to the stream that ran behind the back of their house, lay on her back in the grass, and just watch the birds that soared up in the sky. As she watched them, she would find herself up among them, soaring in the sky with them and feeling one with them. And then suddenly she would find herself back in her body. In later years, she would make the comment that that was her first introduction to the understanding and knowledge that we are all one. When she was young, Myrtle attended services at the Methodist Church, but found that much of the doctrine was unacceptable in her own life. Because of her young age, she once wrote that she would simply affirm the truth in her soul and inside denied that part that she could not accept. And most of what she couldn't accept was the aspect of hell and punishment from God being a part of our life here on earth. In her later years, Myrtle wrote that she always had been passionately in love with God and with nature, and every chance she would get, she would go down to that stream and lie on her back. And she said, I would soak in the love of God from everything around me. When Myrtle was very young, she came down with what doctors determined to be tuberculosis. She grew up hearing how delicate she was and how she must be protected, how she mustn't overdo anything. And because of that affliction, school and learning became especially important to her. She loved to learn and she loved to study and read. If she didn't understand something, she said she would go to sleep at night with a problem in her mind and wake up the next morning knowing the answer to that problem. Once Myrtle graduated from high school, and this is where I do want to share something with you. Myrtle moved to Oberlin, Ohio, and enrolled in the literary course for ladies at Oberlin College. She attended classes for 1 year because at that time women were not able to attend a regular 4-year college. Once she graduated from Oberlin College and the literary course, she was licensed as a teacher. And at that time, she was able to obtain a position as a school teacher in Clinton, Missouri. So in 1868, she moved to Clinton and began teaching school. However, challenges with tuberculosis were increasing more and more. The doctors told her if she wished to survive, she would have to leave there, where the dampness and the cold winters complicated all her symptoms. She was advised to move to Denison, Texas, where there was a community for patients like her. Once Myrtle arrived in Denison in the early 1870s, she joined the local Methodist church. And because the doctors had forbidden her to resume her full-time teaching career, she did some private tutoring for students and joined the Denison Literary Club. What Myrtle didn't know at that time was that God had a hand in all of this because her future husband, Charles Fillmore, was also a member of the Denison Literary Club. Later on in her writings, Myrtle would say that he had told her that when he first met her, something inside of him told him that she was going to be his wife. She said that it wasn't until years later that she told him, the woman always does the choosing, even though it only be to insist upon the man living up to her high ideals. But you were splendid, dear, or I wouldn't have chosen you. When Myrtle was a young girl, she thought that any interest in men would detract her from her pursuit of knowledge and her love of God and of nature. And although 9 years older than Charles, she later wrote that she recognized that Charles actually would enhance her devotion to these matters because he shared many of her interests. She wrote that his spiritual unfolding was in the earliest stages, but that she saw great potential in him. Public school in Denison at that time was very overcrowded. So in 1878, when Myrtle left, felt that she was well enough to go back to full-time teaching, she opened a private school charging $2 per student per month. She wanted to give students a chance to learn in not only less crowded conditions, but also in an environment where each child was honored for their own qualities and talents. The student that she had thrived and quickly passed their peers that were still in the public schools. However, in June, after the school had only been in operation for 6 months, she announced that she would be closing the school and returning to Clinton, Missouri, where she would then teach in the public schools. Because the students were doing so well, the parents asked her to teach them her method of teaching so that they could take over and run the school. Throughout that summer, she taught the parents how to run the school and how to teach, and then left Denison for Clinton. She and Charles corresponded during the first year she had returned to Clinton, and then 3 years later, Charles re-entered her life. In 1880, Charles had been living in Gunnison, Colorado, and he had established himself with a partner in business, he decided that it was time for him to ask Myrtle's hand in marriage. And so on March 29th of 1881, Charles and Myrtle were married. However, because of the financial situation in the country at that time, Charles and Myrtle had to move several times, finally settling down in Kansas City, Missouri. Life in Kansas City for both Myrtle and Charles wasn't easy. Living in the drier areas in Texas and Colorado had been good for Myrtle. Charles, whose leg had stopped growing when he had an accident when he was a very young boy, was having painful challenges with that leg. Myrtle's tuberculosis had flared up, and she had contracted malaria. So no matter what the doctors tried to do, they finally told Myrtle that she only had a short time to live. And they talked about moving from Colorado and moving from Kansas City and returning to Colorado. But Charles had a dream that told him that they were to stay in Kansas City. In the spring of 1886, Myrtle was told that the end of her life was near. At this time, Charles and Myrtle had been attending every health-centered lecture in the area, and one evening they went to hear a lecturer by the name of Dr. E.B. Weeks from the Illinois Metaphysical College. He had been trained by Emma Curtis Hopkins, one of the foremost metaphysicians at that time, and he made the statement that stayed with Myrtle the rest of her life. You are a child of God, therefore you do not inherit sickness. And Myrtle grabbed onto that statement and held onto it with all her might. She had been told all of her life that she had inherited tuberculosis from her parents, that she had been born to be ill and suffer and die prematurely. So she took this statement to heart. She began to talk to her body and its cells And she told her body that it was a creation of God and did not inherit sickness. Days, weeks, and months went by, and gradually she noted an improvement. Closed herself into a room and sat next to an empty chair. She knew that the Spirit of Jesus Christ was in that chair and was supporting her and encouraging her. She studied the four Gospels, especially the parts where Jesus Christ spoke of healings. Another thing she heard was, God is your hereditary parentage. Only what belongs to God belongs to you. By the time Myrtle's healing was complete, about 2 years later, around 1888, Charles had had the healing of his leg also. And with that, they began to prepare to launch into the spiritual work that would become Unity School of Christianity. But Myrtle wasn't satisfied with having her own healing. She wanted to share it with friends and with family. And finally, she shared it in the world with a little article called How I Found Health. And that little pamphlet is still being printed today. After some time of meditating together, reading the Bible, and having Myrtle pray with others in the community, they began to study under Emma Curtis Hopkins, who was the teacher of E.B. Weeks. Let me bring this up. So Emma was involved in organizing the New Thought movement and was a theologian, teacher, writer, feminist, mystic, and healer who taught and ordained hundreds of people, including notably many women. Hopkins was called the teacher of teachers and mother of New Thought because a number of her students went on to found their own churches or to become prominent in the New Thought movement, including Charles and Myrtle, Ernest Holmes, and others. Mrs. Hopkins wrote the book High Mysticism, which is still being printed today. And Mrs. Hopkins actually came to Kansas City more than once to actually teach Myrtle and Charles individually by themselves. One of the students who studied with Charles and Myrtle was H. Emily Cady, who would in 1892 begin writing a series of monthly articles for Unity magazine, which would later be turned into the book Lessons in Truth, which is considered by many to be the cornerstone book of Unity. In 1889, they decided to start a publishing venture. And Charles and Myrtle had decided that it was time that they share the truth that they had found. In 1889, they went on. In April of that year, their magazine Modern Thought was printed for the very first time. And it was a 16-page publication, was as labeled as devoted to the spiritual inflation of humanity from an independent standpoint. And after a few months of printing articles from other lecturers and healers, they decided to concentrate more on just articles that spoke of practical Christianity and articles that would emphasize more eternal truths held within the Christian thought of life. They also changed the name of the magazine to Thought and then later Truth. In the spring of 1891, Charles and Myrtle were praying with some other truth students, and the word unity came to Charles. So at that moment, Unity was born. And there they changed the title of their magazine to Unity Magazine and began publishing under that time from that title. And because Charles and Myrtle had been studying under Emma Curtis Hopkins, They actually graduated as ordained ministers in 1889 from the Hopkins Metaphysical Institute of Chicago. After that, unity began to take on its own particular identity. Charles and Myrtle took what they considered the best of Christian Science from the teachings of Mrs. Hopkins and blended it with their own personal understanding and knowledge of the writings of Jesus. And although at one point a part of the New Thought movement and the International New Thought Alliance, Charles and Myrtle moved away from being associated with them. Myrtle once wrote, "Instead of thinking and saying new thought, it would be better to think and speak God thought." To identify oneself with the Jesus Christ standard of thinking keeps one poised and free and filled with light. So from the beginning of her time of healing, using the words she had heard from Dr. E.B. Weeks, Myrtle was captivated by the power of prayer that she had not known before. Sharing that power of prayer became her main life's work and dedication. She would hold evening meetings in their home where they would invite people to come and hold others in prayer. In 1890, Myrtle formed the Society of Silent Help, which would later be known as Silent Unity. In December 1892, Charles wrote what was called the Dedication and Covenant. It reads, "We, Charles Fillmore and Myrtle Fillmore, husband and wife, hereby dedicate ourselves, our time, our money, and all we have and all we expect to have to the Spirit of Truth, and through it to the Society of Silent Unity. It being understood and agreed that the said Spirit of Truth shall render unto us an equivalent for this dedication in peace of mind, healthy body, wisdom, understanding, love, life, and an abundant supply of all things necessary to meet every want without our making any of these things the object of our existence. In the presence of the conscious mind of Christ Jesus, this 7th day of December, AD 1892. And they did just that. Charles and Myrtle dedicated, Charles and Myrtle dedicated their entire lives to the unity movement and to bring a much higher spiritual thought and way of living to the masses. But it wasn't just to adults that unity philosophy was directed. One evening, Myrtle had a vision in which a large crowd of people gathered around her. Many were children, and within herself, she heard a voice saying, "Who will take care of the children?" And just after that, the voice said, "You are to take care of the children. This is your work." Myrtle felt that the unity philosophy should actually be taught to children from the day they are born, so that they could be raised knowing the truth about who they are, that they are beloved children of God, whole, complete, and perfect, just as they are. Because Myrtle felt that children needed a magazine of their own with stories and poetries and prayers written for children in the way that children could read it. So in 1893, the first issue of We Wisdom magazine was published. And this magazine for children was published until 1891, when they ceased publication of it due to a low subscription rate. Become more official and more legal as an actual spiritual movement. In 1903, the Unity Society of Practical Christianity was incorporated. As time went on, Charles and Myrtle wanted to begin teaching others to assist in spreading the Unity's philosophy. So in 1914, the Unity School of Christianity was incorporated. As the Unity movement and its philosophy spread, more and more people were hearing about the amazing healing work that was being done through the Society of Silent Help. More and more letters were coming in and requesting prayer help. Myrtle began dedicating more and more of her time to personally answer each and every one of the letters that were coming in. She would write each person back with thoughts of truth about who they were and about their health, their finances, relationships, or whatever challenge they were facing. In 2006, the book Myrtle Fillmore's Healing Letters was published for the very first time. Copies of her original writings are in there, so if you want to see how Myrtle wrote, this is a great book to look over. As Unity was publishing several different monthly magazines by this time, Myrtle felt they should have a magazine that could be separated into daily prayers or affirmations that a person could pick up and have something different to read each and every day. So in 1924, the first Daily Word magazine was published, and as we know, it's still being published today. By this time, the first 58 acres of Unity Farm, and then known as Unity Village, had been purchased. They were developing it into a place where everything could be done on one site rather than in different buildings as they were being done at this time. There were so many letters coming in for prayer assistance that Myrtle felt that they should have a place where more people could assist her in answering each and every one of the letters. So construction began to build such a building. And in 1929, the tower and the Silent Unity building at Unity Farm were completed and occupied. Myrtle was once asked why she was so dedicated to assisting people with their problems and their challenges. And she replied, it's a matter of individual growth, a learning to draw upon the individual's own inner spiritual resources and make practical use of them. Myrtle was a strong believer in using affirmations. Some of the first words that she wrote that were to be held in silent thought every night for 1 month were these: God is all goodness and everywhere present. He is the loving Father, and I am his child and have all his attributes of life, love, truth, and intelligence. In him is all health, strength, wisdom, and harmony, and as his child, all of these become mine by a recognition of the truth that God is all. In the late summer of 1931, Myrtle came to the realization that her time on this plane of existence was coming to an end. She began to tell people that she would be passing soon and that they would be taking over the work for her. When asked why she felt she had to leave, she replied, I believe it would be easier for me to do the work that is ahead by being from the invisible plane. In the days prior to Myrtle leaving, people noted that she was radiant, peaceful, and filled with love. And then on Tuesday, October 6th of 1931, Myrtle made her transition, and she was 86 years of age. I would like to finish this message with a poem that Myrtle wrote for one of the We Wisdom magazines. Monday. If you want the good to grow, watch the little words you sow. Tuesday. If you want life's blossoms rare, pull out thoughts that wear and tear. Wednesday. Loving good is always brought into sight through loving thought. Thursday. If you want me to smile, take one with you all the while. Friday, kind and loving deeds attract, and like the echo, come right back. Saturday, What we give, we surely get. Love for love and fret for fret. And Saturday, this sweet law, dear Lord, I know I will reap the good I sow. Thank you for listening to this talk today. I truly wanted to share with you so much about Myrtle. She has been an inspiration to me in my life, and I truly wanted to share that inspiration with you. So God bless everyone. Have an absolutely beautiful rest of your day. Namaste.